The wind howling through Lolo Pass doesn't carry secrets, it buries them. In the bitter autumn of 1878, a 17-year-old girl was discarded in the freezing Idaho dirt, left to die by the woman supposed to be her mother. But the mountains didn't claim her. A phantom of the high country did. The dust of the wagon train had long settled by the time Cora Mitchell realized she was truly alone. It was October 14, 1878, a day that would forever be etched into the frostbitten edges of her memory. For 3 weeks, the wagon train had been pushing relentlessly toward the Oregon Territory, racing against the looming threat of the first winter snows. Cora's father, William Mitchell, a hopeful prospector with a claim waiting in the Willamette Valley, had succumbed to cholera near Fort Laramie. He was buried under a pile of heavy stones to keep the scavengers at bay, taking with him the only shield Cora had in this unforgiving world. Left behind was William's second wife, Matilda Rutledge. Matilda was a woman carved from flint, with eyes the color of dirty ice and a heart entirely consumed by the prospect of inheriting William's gold claim. To Matilda, the 17-year-old stepdaughter was not family. She was a useless mouth to feed, a liability who held legal rights to half of William's estate. The abandonment was executed with chilling simplicity. The caravan had paused at the base of a treacherous incline near Lolo Pass, deep in the Bitterroot Mountains. The air was already biting, the sky a bruised purple that promised a hard freeze. Matilda had handed Cora a battered tin bucket, pointing a gloved finger toward a steep, rocky ravine. "Fetch water for the oxen, Cora," Matilda had ordered, her voice devoid of any warmth. "And don't dally. We have miles to make before sundown." Cora had obeyed, sliding down the treacherous shale, her worn leather boots offering little traction. It took her nearly an hour to find the trickle of a creek, fill the bucket, and painstakingly climb back up the ridge. When she crested the hill, her lungs burning and hands raw from the cold, the clearing was empty. There was no mistake. The deep ruts of the Conestoga wagons stretched out toward the western horizon, already fading in the twilight. They hadn't forgotten her. They had fled from her. Matilda had deliberately timed the departure, knowing the rough terrain would delay the girl just long enough. "Ma!" Cora screamed, the word tearing at her throat, though she had never truly viewed the woman as a mother. "Wait, please." Only the mocking echo of the canyon answered her. She dropped the bucket, the water spilling into the dry earth, and ran. She ran along the wheel ruts until her chest heaved and her legs buckled beneath her. As the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, plunging the world into a deep freezing blue, the reality of her situation settled over her like a shroud. She had no coat, no food, no weapons, and only a half-empty canteen strapped to her shoulder. The first night was a brutal lesson in mountain survival. Cora found the shallow overhang of rock and huddled into a tight ball, shivering violently as the temperature plummeted. The wilderness was not silent. It was alive with the snapping of twigs, the rustle of unseen predators, and the haunting, mournful howl of gray wolves echoing across the valley. She pressed her hands over her ears, crying quietly, begging her late father for forgiveness, for help, for a swift end. By the morning of the second day, hunger began to claw at her stomach. She wandered aimlessly along the trail, hoping against hope that a trailing wagon or a detachment of cavalry might pass. But Lolo Pass in late October was a graveyard for travelers. The route was effectively abandoned until the spring thaw. Cora survived on pine needles and snowmelt. By the third day, the freezing temperatures began to take a severe toll. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her extremities numb. The vibrant green of the pines seemed to blur into a sickening, hazy gray. Delirium began to set in. She saw her father walking ahead of her, his warm smile beckoning her into the snowy timber. "I'm coming, Papa," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She took one step off the trail, then another, wading into knee-deep snowdrifts. Her foot caught on a hidden root and she went down hard. The impact knocked the remaining wind from her lungs. She lay there in the snow, the biting cold slowly giving way to a strange numbing warmth. The sky above her faded to black. Cora closed her eyes, surrendering to the merciless embrace of the bitter roots. Gideon Hayes did not care for the company of men. The Civil War had burned the humanity out of him at Antietam, leaving behind a scarred, quiet man who preferred the honest brutality of the mountains to the deceitful smiles of civilization. At 34, he was a giant of a man, clad in worn buckskin and thick furs, his jaw covered in a dense, dark beard. He lived in a hand-hewn cabin high above the Clearwater River, trapping beaver and hunting elk, descending to the trading posts only once a year. It was the erratic behavior of his draft horse Goliath that drew Gideon off his hunting trail that afternoon. The massive roan gelding snorted, stamping his hooves and refusing to move past a thick stand of lodgepole pines. Gideon dismounted, his Sharps rifle resting easy in his hands. He scanned the tree line, expecting a mountain lion or a grizzly. Instead, he found a patch of disturbed snow and a scrap of calico fabric snagged on a bramble bush. Following the tracks, he found her. She was half buried in a drift, her pale face nearly matching the snow, her lips a dangerous shade of blue. Gideon dropped his rifle and knelt beside her, pulling off his heavy bear fur glove to press two calloused fingers to her throat. The pulse was there, but it was a faint, fluttering moth of a heartbeat. "Lord Almighty," Gideon muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble unused to speech. He didn't hesitate. He stripped off his heavy, fur-lined coat and wrapped it tightly around her fragile frame. He lifted her effortlessly into his arms. She weighed no more than a bundle of dry kindling. Securing her across Goliath's saddle, Gideon led the horse on foot, setting a grueling pace up the steep incline toward his cabin. Every minute the girl remained in the cold was a minute closer to the grave. The cabin was a sanctuary of rough-hewn logs, smelling strongly of wood smoke, dried sage, and tan hides. Gideon laid her on his own cot, near the stone hearth. He stoked the embers into a roaring fire, then set to work with the pragmatic efficiency of a man used to keeping death at bay. He had to get her out of her frozen wet clothes. There was no room for modesty when hypothermia had its grip. He dressed her in an oversized woolen union suit of his own, piling every pelt and blanket he owned on top of her. He heated river stones in the fire, wrapped them in thick cloth, then placed them at her feet and under her arms to force warmth back into her core. For 3 days and 3 nights, Kara hovered between this world and the next. The freezing gave way to a violent burning fever. She thrashed under the heavy furs, screaming for her father, pleading with Matilda not to leave her. Gideon rarely slept. He sat in a high-backed wooden chair beside the bed, dampening a cloth and a bucket of cold water to wipe her brow. He forced bitter willow bark tea and warm elk broth between her cracked lips. He listened to her delirious ramblings, piecing together the grim puzzle of how a young girl ended up discarded on the Lolo Trail. A cold, familiar anger settled in his chest, the kind of anger he usually reserved for men who abused their horses or shot animals and left them to rot. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever finally broke. Cora opened her eyes. The blinding white of the snow was gone, replaced by the warm amber glow of a fire. She stared at the ceiling, tracing the heavy log beams with her eyes. Slowly she turned her head. Sitting by the fire, sharpening a hunting knife on a whetstone, was the most intimidating man she had ever seen. He was massive, rugged, and completely silent. Cora bolted upright, pulling the heavy furs up to her chin, her eyes wide with terror. "Where am I?" she rasped. Gideon stopped his work. He looked at her, his dark eyes entirely unreadable. "Safe," he said simply. "High timber, above the Clearwater. My." My stepmother, the wagons, gone, Gideon replied bluntly. He wasn't a man to sugarcoat the truth. Snow closed the pass 2 days ago. They're either in Oregon or dead, and they left you to be the latter. Tears welled in Cora's eyes, the brutal reality crashing down on her all over again. She buried her face in her hands and wept, a raw, agonizing sound that echoed loudly in the quiet cabin. Gideon didn't try to comfort her with hollow words. He simply poured a cup of hot, chicory coffee, walked over, and set it on the small wooden table beside the bed. Drink, he ordered softly. Tears waste water. Over the next few weeks, a delicate, fragile routine formed in the cabin. Cora was too weak to leave the bed for the first 10 days. Gideon proved to be an unexpectedly gentle caretaker, despite his frightening exterior. He cooked hearty stews, kept the fire blazing, and brought her books from a small, dusty shelf, tattered copies of Dickens and an old almanac. As Cora's strength returned, so did her spirit. She was not a girl to sit idle. She insisted on mending his torn shirts, sweeping the rough plank floors, and learning how to prepare the game he brought home. The silence between them, initially thick with tension, slowly became comfortable. But a problem loomed as the winter deepened. By late November, a passing U.S. Marshal, Eli Harrison, snow-showed up to the cabin to check on Gideon, a courtesy among mountain men. When Harrison saw Cora, his hand instinctively went to his belt. "Who's the girl, Hayes?" Harrison demanded, his eyes narrowing. "You know the law about holding folks against their will. If she's a runaway, she goes back to the nearest settlement orphanage." Cora's heart dropped. The orphanages in the frontier towns were notorious glorified workhouses where children were starved and worked to the bone. Before Cora could speak, Gideon stepped between her and the marshal, his massive frame blocking her from view. "She ain't a runaway, Eli," Gideon lied smoothly, his voice steady. "She's my kin, brother's girl from back east. Lost her folks to the pox. I sent for her. I've taken her in, adopted her as my own ward, legal and true under frontier right." Harrison studied Gideon's hard face, then looked at Cora. "That true, miss?" Cora looked at the man who had pulled her from the snow, who had fed her and guarded her while she slept. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice unwavering. "He's my guardian." Harrison tipped his hat, satisfied. "All right then, keep her warm, Hayes. It's going to be a brutal winter." When the marshal left, Cora looked at Gideon, her hands trembling slightly. "You lied to him. Why?" Gideon turned back to the fire, tossing a heavy log onto the flames. "Because the trail took everything from you," he said, his back to her. "I wasn't about to let the law take what's left." It was in that moment, watching the firelight dance across Gideon's broad shoulders, that Cora realized she was no longer an abandoned orphan. She was the ward of the mountain. And as the snow piled high against the cabin walls, trapping them together for the long winter, the ice around both of their hearts slowly began to thaw. The brutal winter of 1878 slowly relinquished its icy grip on the Bitterroot Mountains, giving way to a muddy, vibrant spring. As the snowmelt swelled the Clearwater River, a profound transformation took root inside Gideon's cabin. The frail, terrified 17-year-old girl who had nearly died at Lolo Pass was gone. In her place stood a resilient, capable young woman. Cora Mitchell had turned 18 during the deep freezes of January. Under Gideon's patient, silent tutelage, she had learned to skin a rabbit, track a wounded buck through light powder, and fire a heavy Winchester rifle without bruising her shoulder. The physical labor had put color in her cheeks and a newfound strength in her limbs. She no longer looked at the jagged peaks with fear. She looked at them as home. Gideon, too, had changed. The suffocating silence of his isolated existence had been broken by Cora's laughter and her stubborn insistence on reading Charles Dickens aloud by the fire. He found himself rushing back from his traplines, eager to see the smoke rising from the chimney. Yet an unspoken tension hung between them. Gideon was acutely aware of the 16 years between them and the scars he carried from Antietam. He treated her with a fierce, protective reverence, terrified that his growing affection for her was a betrayal of his role as her guardian. But the outside world was not content to leave them in peace. In late May, their supplies ran dangerously low, forcing them to make the long trek down the mountain to the bustling trading post town of Lewiston, Idaho. The muddy streets were choked with prospectors, cattlemen, and the ever-present opportunists of the frontier. As Gideon loaded sacks of flour and coffee into a rented buckboard wagon outside the general store, Cora walked to the assayer's office to trade their winter pelts. It was there, stepping out onto the wooden boardwalk, that the ghost of her past materialized. "Cora, Lord in heaven, it's a miracle." Cora froze. The voice was shrill, cutting through the din of the street. She turned to see Matilda Rutledge pushing through the crowd. Her stepmother was dressed in expensive dark silk, a stark contrast to the dust of the trail. Beside Matilda stood a tall, sinewy man with cold, dead eyes and twin Colt revolvers strapped low on his hips. He wore the brass badge of a Pinkerton detective, though his demeanor screamed hired gun. Panic seized Cora's chest. "Ma," she whispered, taking a step back. "I thought you were dead," Matilda cried, putting on a masterful theatrical display of motherly grief for the onlookers. She reached out, her gloved hands gripping Cora's forearms like iron vices. "When you wandered off from the wagon train, we searched for days. Oh, my poor lost girl, you left me," Cora said, her voice shaking but growing louder. "You gave me a bucket and you drove away." "Hush now, the trauma has addled your mind," Matilda said, her eyes flashing with a venomous private threat. "Josiah, help my daughter to the hotel. We are taking her home." The hired gun, Josiah Flint, stepped forward, his hand reaching for Cora. "Come along, miss. Your mother's been worried sick." Before Flint's hand could touch her, a massive shadow fell over them. Gideon Hayes stepped onto the boardwalk, his presence immediately parting the crowd. He didn't yell or draw his weapon, but the sheer radiating menace of his posture made Flint pause. "Take your hand off my ward," Gideon rumbled, his voice low and dangerous. Matilda sneered, looking Gideon up and down with absolute disgust. "And who are you? Some mountain savage? This girl is my legal stepdaughter. I am her sole surviving guardian. You lost the right to that title when you left her to freeze at Lolo Pass," Gideon countered, stepping between Cora and Flint. The town's commotion had drawn the attention of Marshal Eli Harrison, who pushed his way through the gathered crowd. "All right, break it up. Hayes, what's the trouble here?" "Marshal Harrison," Matilda interrupted, producing a folded, wax-sealed document from her reticule. "I am Matilda Mitchell. This is my stepdaughter, Cora. She wandered from our camp last autumn. I hired Mr. Flint here to find her. I have the legal paperwork from a Denver judge affirming my guardianship. I demand you arrest this man for kidnapping." Harrison looked at the paperwork, his face tightening. He remembered his visit to the cabin. He looked at Cora's terrified face and Gideon's clenched fists. "Is this true, Cora?" Harrison asked quietly. "Is she your stepmother?" "Yes," Cora admitted, her voice cracking. "But she tried to kill me, Marshal. She abandoned me on purpose. The twist of the knife came not from a gun, but from the law." Matilda hadn't spent the winter mourning. She had spent it in Denver, discovering a bitter truth. William Mitchell's gold claim in the Willamette Valley was part of an ironclad trust. Matilda couldn't sell it, couldn't mine it, and couldn't touch a single dollar of the estate without the notarized signature of his only blood heir, Cora. The wagon train abandonment had been a clumsy mistake, leaving no body to prove Cora's death. Matilda needed her stepdaughter alive just long enough to sign the deed over her, And then Josiah Flint would ensure Cora suffered a tragic accident on the journey back. "Marshal," Flint said smoothly, tapping his badge, "the law is the law. The paper says she belongs with her mother. If this mountain man interferes, he's guilty of abduction." Harrison was trapped by his badge. "Hayes, legally I can't stop her from taking the girl." Gideon looked at Cora. The terror in her eyes shattered the stoic wall he had built around his heart. He wasn't going to let the law dictate morality. "We're leaving," Gideon stated, grabbing Cora's hand. Flint's hand dropped to his Colt. "I don't think so, friend." Quicker than a rattlesnake strike, Gideon's heavy fist swung in a brutal arc, catching Flint squarely on the jaw. The hired gun collapsed backward into a horse trough with a loud splash. Before the deputies could react, Gideon swept Cora off her feet, threw her into the buckboard, and cracked the reins over the rented horses. They tore out of Lewiston in a cloud of dust, leaving a screaming Matilda and a furious, soaking wet Josiah Flint in their wake. They were no longer just survivors of the mountains, they were fugitives. The ride back to the high timber was grueling. Gideon pushed the horses to the brink, knowing that Flint and whatever men he could buy in Lewiston would not be far behind. Matilda had the law, the money, and the motivation to see them both dead. By the time they reached the cabin, a violent spring thunderstorm had rolled over the bitter roots, masking their tracks but plunging the mountains into a dark, torrential downpour. Gideon immediately set to work boarding up the windows with heavy oak planks, leaving only narrow slits for his rifle barrel. "Gideon," Cora said, her hands trembling as she helped him load boxes of ammunition onto the table. "They're going to kill you because of me. You should go. Let them take me. I'll sign the deed, and maybe—" Gideon stopped his work. He walked over to her, taking her trembling, cold hands in his massive, scarred ones. He looked down at her, the usual guarded distance in his eyes completely stripped away. "Cora," he said softly, the thunder rumbling outside mirroring the raw emotion in his chest. "I left my soul in Pennsylvania during the war. I came up to this mountain to die a slow, quiet death. You brought me back to life. I ain't letting that woman take you, not while I still draw breath. Do you understand me?" Tears spilled over her lashes. She didn't offer words. She simply stepped forward and pressed her lips to his. It was a desperate, fierce kiss, tasting of rain and fear and an undeniable, earth-shattering love. Gideon's arms wrapped around her, holding her tighter than he ever had, cementing a vow that required no preacher. The tender moment was shattered by the sharp crack of a rifle. A bullet splintered the heavy oak door, missing Gideon's head by inches. The posse had arrived. "Get down!" Gideon roared, shoving Cora behind the heavy stone hearth. He snatched up his Sharps rifle and leveled it through a window slit. Outside, illuminated by flashes of lightning, Josiah Flint and 3 hired guns from Lewiston had surrounded the cabin. Matilda stood further back beneath the dripping pines, a dark silhouette of pure malice. "Send the girl out, Hayes," Flint shouted over the roaring wind. "You do that, and we'll let you ride out of here. Keep her, and we burn this cabin to the ground with both of you inside." Gideon's answer was a deafening roar from the Sharps. One of the hired guns screamed and clutched his thigh, falling into the mud. Hell broke loose. Volleys of lead tore through the cabin's log walls, shattering pottery and filling the air with suffocating wood dust. Gideon moved with terrifying efficiency, reloading and firing, moving from slit to slit to give the illusion of a dozen men, but there were too many of them. As Gideon leaned toward a gap to take aim at Flint, a slug tore through the chinking of the logs and caught him high in the right shoulder. The impact spun him around, throwing him violently to the floor. "Gideon!" Cora screamed, scrambling out from behind the hearth. Blood was already pooling beneath his heavy canvas shirt. He tried to lift the rifle with his left hand, but the pain made him grit his teeth in a breathless hiss. "I'm all right," he rasped, though his face was gray. "Keep your head down." Cora looked at the man bleeding on the floor. She looked at the rifle. The terrified girl from Lolo Pass was dead. In her place was a woman forged by the bitter roots. She grabbed the Winchester rifle from the table. She didn't hide. She moved to the barricaded window, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a man carrying a burning pitch torch toward the side of the cabin. She took a breath, steadied her hands just as Gideon had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The man dropped the torch, clutching his shoulder as he fell into the wet grass, the rain immediately extinguishing the flames. "Flint," Matilda's shrill voice echoed from the trees. "Stop playing with them. Shoot the door off its hinges." Flint charged the porch, firing both Colts blindly through the wood. Cora tracked his movement to the cracks. As he paused to reload, she kicked away the heavy oak bar securing the door and threw it open. Flint looked up in shock. Before he could raise his weapons, Cora leveled the Winchester squarely at his chest. "Drop them," she ordered, her voice cutting through the rain with chilling authority. Flint hesitated, calculating his odds against a girl. It was a fatal miscalculation. Cora fired, putting a bullet straight through the dirt at his feet, spraying his boots with mud. "The next one goes through your heart, Mr. Flint," she promised. Slowly, Flint dropped the Colts. The remaining hired gun, seeing their leader bested, not being paid enough to die in the mud, threw his hands up and backed away. Suddenly, the sound of galloping hooves cut through the storm. Marshal Eli Harrison and 4 deputies burst into the clearing, their rifles drawn. Harrison had dug through the telegraph records in Lewiston after the altercation, discovering the truth about William Mitchell's will and a previous warrant for Josiah Flint in Colorado. "Drop your weapons, all of you," Harrison bellowed. Matilda tried to run into the timber, but a deputy cut her off, dragging her back into the clearing by her arm. She shrieked, kicking and fighting as the cold iron cuffs were snapped onto her wrists. "You can't do this," Matilda screamed, the rain ruining her silk dress and washing away her dignified facade. "I am her mother. I own that claim. You own a cell in the federal penitentiary, Mrs. Rutledge," Harrison said grimly. "Attempted murder, fraud, and hiring a known fugitive. Take her away." As the deputies hauled Flint and Matilda off the mountain, Harrison walked up the porch steps. He looked at the shattered door, at Cora standing tall with the rifle, and at Gideon, who had managed to pull himself up into a chair, pressing a bloody rag to his shoulder. "I suppose I owe you an apology, Hayes," Harrison said, tipping his soaked hat. "And you, Miss Cora, your father's claim is yours now. You are a very wealthy woman. You can go anywhere in the world." Cora lowered the rifle. She looked out at the vast, wild expanse of the Bitterroots, and then she turned back to look at the rugged, bleeding mountain man sitting by the hearth. "I'm already exactly where I belong," she said. 2 months later, the summer sun bathed the high timber in warm, golden light. A circuit judge from Missoula stood on the porch of the repaired cabin, reading from a worn Bible. Gideon stood tall, his shoulder fully healed, wearing a clean shirt and a rare, genuine smile. Cora wore a simple dress woven from mountain wildflowers, holding his hand with an unbreakable grip. They didn't claim the gold in Oregon. They sold the deed, using a fraction of the fortune to buy thousands of acres of the surrounding wilderness, ensuring no prospector or logger would ever touch it. The orphan girl had been left to die on a cold, unforgiving trail, but the mountain hadn't broken her. It had saved her, and in return she had saved the beast who lived upon it. If you love this Wild West tale of survival, betrayal, and true love, please hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love historical romance, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life inspired dramas. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite part of Cora and Gideon's journey. Your support keeps these frontier stories alive.